on Zoom. You'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into the Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from today. We're delighted you can be with us. We have a great discussion ahead, but before we move to today's panel, just a few words about some upcoming events at WIDA. If you plan to be in Washington, D.C. On July 19th, that's the night of the WIDA annual dinner. The dinner itself is sold out, but we've made tickets available to the pre and post-dinner receptions if you wish to mix and mingle with the DC trade community, which I know for some people is the best part of this annual tradition. We're also cooking up a couple events for late July and early August. One we're working on with the Asia Society Policy Institute is to look at the fastest growing electric car manufacturer in the world, China's BYD, and what its growth may mean for trade policy. It may come up, I don't know if it'll come up at all today in the discussion, China and electric cars. And we're also cooking up a seminar on artificial intelligence in trade. So keep your eye on your inboxes for announcement about both of these events. Now to today's event. As you know, if you've watched any of our more than 200 webinars in the past 3 years, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. Today, we're joined by viewers in 17 countries, including Prudence Gordon at the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, Francisco Piero at DG Trade at the European Commission in Brussels, Bin Li at the International Coordinating Council on Trans-Eurasian Transportation in China, Michael Roberts at the WTO in Geneva, and Brett Gibson at the AFL-CIO here in the United States. Welcome, Prudence, Francisco, Ben, Michael, and Brett, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have received a copy of today's event program by email this morning, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions of our speakers. You can also ask questions on Zoom today using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can during today's session. Big thanks to Silverado Policy Accelerator for their ongoing support for WIDA's Trade and the Environment series and their help with today's event. And we'd like to welcome today to the WIDA webinar platform 3 new guests and 2 people who have been with us before. Joining us for the first time are Lachlan Carey at the Rocky Mountain Institute, Helaina Matza at the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment at the U.S. Department of State, Dave Schwietert at the Chief Policy Officer at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And welcome back to Andrew Jory, Minister-Counsellor for Trade at the Embassy of Australia, and our moderator today, Adina Renee Adler, Deputy Executive Director of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Adina, thank you for all your help in pulling today's event together, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Adina?
Thank you so much, Ken. This was a fun one to put together because I know it's a topic that's sort of top of mind for everybody. And so thank you all so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world. So let's get to it. Critical minerals, you know, they got their name in World War II as the original 5 needed for the war effort. Nickel, nitrates, platinum, potash, and tin were in critically short supply. But today that list has swelled to 50 in the United States, or 45 in Canada, 26 in Australia, 18 in high criticality, or 5 increasingly so in the UK, and 34 listed in the EU's critical minerals list. And of course, it's been defined, at least in the US, by the US Geological Survey, as those essential to the economic or national security of the United States, and which has a supply chain vulnerable to disruption. And they are critical or essential or indispensable or elemental, depending on your thesaurus, to our green energy transition, the national defense, cutting edge healthcare, and the advanced technology revolution that's taking place now. And because of that, we at Silverado, as I know all of you, are hyper-focused on this topic and how do we plan for the future. Our work at Silverado started as we were simultaneously looking at the pandemic semiconductor supply chain disruptions as well as efforts maybe to restart environmental goods trade and how do you support the green energy transition. And we notice that there's this Asian detour that critical minerals take on their mine to manufacturing journey. And so on our website, we have several dashboards that show this in the EV supply chain, specific to lithium, on semiconductors, and even tied into Russian sanctions. And it's so important, as you all know, Ken and the team dedicated the entirety of last week's WIDA Friday Focus on Trade newsletter to this topic. And I know you all read it top to bottom because it was there were some really good read aheads for today's discussion. There were some great articles on the EU Buyers Club, friendshoring, and Germany's particular interest in lithium. So let's get to the discussion. As Ken said, I am joined today by an incredible lineup of speakers that will bring views from all angles on building resilience in our critical mineral supply chains. We will start with Lachlan Carey, the manager at Rocky Mountain Institute, who is leading work on U.S. regional economic development through clean energy investment. And having Lachlan here today is a great reminder that this critical minerals issue is not new. He's been writing on it for a number of years, including during his time at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And so he's going to kick us off with a scene setter of the critical minerals landscape. And then following him, we'll have Helaina Matza, and I'm going to give her a promotion. She's the acting special coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII, serving as the U.S. Sherpa for this G7 initiative that mobilizes financing and investment in the world's most critical infrastructure needs in low and middle income countries. And she's been at the State Department doing this for several years. She was at the White House also doing it. So she also has been watching this really important issue for a number of years. And she has her finger on the pulse on all the USG activity in the critical minerals space. So I'm looking forward to her kind of laying it all out for us. And then we're joined by Andrew Jory, who's the Minister-Counsellor for Trade at the Embassy of Australia here in Washington. And many of you all know Andrew, who's been around goods negotiations for the Australian government, having served as a Deputy Chief Negotiator in the EU-Australia FTA, worked on TPP, he served in Geneva. I think you have a lot of friends online here, Andrew. And of course, Australia is a very important ally and essential raw material supplier. So we look forward to him elaborating on the US-Australia partnership there. And last but most definitely not least is Dave Schwietert, the Chief Policy Officer at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, where he works to advance the association's legislative and regulatory agenda when it comes to cleaner, safer, and smarter future. And he previously worked for a number of years in the Senate. Dave also has lots of friends online here, having worked in the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And he also worked for the EPW subcommittee on Superfund and waste management issues. So he'll talk about where the EV revolution kind of fits within all of this discussion on the critical mineral supply chain. So Lachlan, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Adina. And I just want to say a big thank you to WIDA and to Silverado for inviting me here today. And to just say that I think it's very appropriate that we have two Australians on this particular panel on critical minerals. As you say, I think that relationship is going to be really important going forward. So I just wanted to sort of open today's discussion a little bit by zooming out and thinking about the context in which we're having this conversation. I think you can't have that contextual conversation without talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. I mean, IRA has really changed the game here. Obviously, domestically is this huge demand injection into clean energy technologies and then right throughout that supply chain. But those effects are also going to happen globally. And it's a huge demand push, but it's also a huge policy push. And I think we're seeing countries start to race to the top, as it were, in really thinking about how to compete with this sort of game-changing industrial strategy. To put a few numbers to it, our estimates put it at an average of something like $100 billion a year worth of climate and clean energy spending That's more than 3 times the amount that the US has ever put into this sector before from the federal government. Cumulatively, we see estimates as high as $1 trillion worth of total spending over the next 5 to 10 years. If you put that in context globally, that's, according to IEA numbers, by far the largest injection of any sort of high income nation over the last 3 years. And only Norway, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Italy have a higher rate of spending per person. So it's really just a pretty extraordinary injection here. And if we think about what that translates into in the US context, whether it's solar build out, the NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has put estimates that we expect to see a 300% increase in annual deployment of solar. So that's about 45 gigawatts per year, leading to roughly 70 to 80% clean electricity generation by 2030. Our own estimates here at RMI expect to see EV sales annually reach about 75% by 2030. And that translates into about 1,000 gigawatts per year of annual battery demand. So it's about 900 or so in light duty, a little bit more, so up to 300 in medium and heavy duty. And so what we've really got is this moment where, in a sense, climate and clean energy advocates are like the dog that caught the car. We've got it, now we need to figure out what to do with it. So we have all this demand coming down the pike, and we need to figure out how to meet it with supply. And clearly critical minerals are just going to be a huge part of that. But they're not the only one. I want to stress that, everything from, there's still a huge research and development challenge. There's still a huge infrastructure challenge in building out the pipelines, transmission infrastructure, EV charging stations, and of course the permitting and siting challenge when it comes to the deployment of all this solar, wind, and manufacturing facilities. But obviously critical minerals hold a really particular place in this supply sort of bottleneck conversation as part of the broader supply chain challenge. And I think the real reason for that is because of the lead time in these projects. So it can take 1 to 3 years to build a manufacturing facility, whereas it can take between 5 to 20 years to get through the whole process for building out a mine and mineral extraction facility. And if we look at the sort of highest demand from a volume perspective, that's going to be copper. I mean, we need copper in EVs, we need copper in the electric grid. So from a pure volume standpoint, that's where the largest challenge is. And it just so happens that that's also the longest lead time of all these projects. And so it's an average of about 8 years. And that's, that's just from the feasibility study to production. And so in that context, I think, there's a real reason that we got to focus on this. The IEA estimate that about half of all the investment we need in this sector needs to happen in just the next 2 to 5 years because of that lead time factor. Globally, that puts it at about an average of $270 billion a year. To put that number in perspective, that's 7 times the average rate of the last 5 years. In just the 4 key critical minerals in that list, so cobalt, copper, lithium, and nickel, the investment we need is equal to the entire investment of the metals mining industry in 2021. So the challenge here is pretty astronomical. And of course, the other key piece of the IRA is not just the demand injection, but the way that the bill has been written. And so you can't talk about it without thinking about the domestic content provisions and the focus on building out a manufacturing supply chain here in the United States. And there are a couple of reasons for that I think we constantly need to keep in mind, because this isn't just a supply chain challenge with regard to climate change. It's also a supply chain challenge with regards to China, with regards to the economy, and with regards to the politics, which you really can't leave out of the conversation when you're talking about climate change. So of course, when we're talking about competing in supply chains, we're talking about competing with China, who has a 10-year head start on most Western countries when it comes to this. They've been investing in industrial policy and in vertically integrated supply chains for at least a decade. And so you really see this geopolitical competition arising between these sort of great powers over the technologies that are really going to define the 21st century. And of course, we would add to that semiconductors and AI as well. There's also the economic challenge here. I mean, part of the reason the Biden administration is trying to invest in supply chains is because they're trying to build, as Biden puts it, an economy from the bottom up and middle out. And what that really means is investing in manufacturing jobs where you have sort of lower education requirements, investing in parts of the country that have sort of seen or been hollowed out over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And then finally, there's the political element to this. And, there aren't a lot of bipartisan sort of topics of agreement in DC, but it happens that China and manufacturing jobs are two of them. On the other hand, climate change certainly is not. And so it's really a kind of distraction strategy almost to bring these topics to the fore as a way of really promoting climate. So I just wanted to put the sort of broad parameters around this conversation, and happy to dive into more of the details of, what minerals are required and so on.
That's really helpful, Lachlan. Thank you so much. I'm going to park the China question for a second because I think that's something for everybody to comment in. But if I can just ask you one quick follow-up, Lachlan, you mentioned the critical importance of copper, especially as it has such a long lead time and it's so useful in so many different aspects, including EVs and electric. But copper is not listed as a critical mineral in the United States. And I don't know if you can comment briefly on what would it take to have copper listed as a critical mineral here in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you look at the DOE's critical mineral report, they sort of don't put it amongst its list. And, there are good reasons for that because it is one of the more established industries. It's coming from a much higher base. And so, I think we can think about those supply chain challenges and the sheer volumetric sort of challenge of investing in that particular mineral, even if we don't technically define it as a critical mineral, because I think that's sort of getting at a specific challenge of addressing the supply risks in markets that are sort of less sort of developed or built out. But I think it's really important to keep in this conversation. The IEA expects the energy transition demand as a share of total copper demand to go from about 25% today to about 45% in 2030. So, that's significant. It's nothing like lithium or nickel where we see, 60, 90% of total demand being related to the clean energy transition, but it's still a really significant share. And I think a really important part of this conversation.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that. Helaina, Lachlan already brought up some geopolitics, but tell us a little bit about, where the U.S. government has really been staging their focus in the critical minerals space.
Sure. Happy to do so. And thank you so much for having me today. So I generally start these talks with a very clear view of how the administration looks at this moment in time and the president in particular. And that's that we're in a really amazing, transformative moment in our history, right? There are two really interesting revolutions happening at the same time. In one, the world is getting faster, more interconnected, and more reliant. That creates a whole new set of opportunities and challenges as we think about digital connectivity, AI, and some of the needs we have for our other essential supply chains. The other is the energy transformation, which is completely changing the geopolitics of energy in real time. But we still learn many lessons from the challenges related to being overly reliant on any one supplier just this past year and a half through Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the implications that had to global energy markets. That is not lost on anybody who is making decisions in the energy space, both at home and overseas. It's also an opportunity to really invest in a meaningful way in jobs here at home and innovation and leveraging the best elements of our connectivity to global markets. And that was really the ethos that led a lot of our early action in the early days of this administration, with a handful of executive orders and reports specifically focused on how we secure supply chains and how we tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad, and doing both of those in a way that creates jobs, innovation, and harnessing important relationships we have around the world. I think this group is probably pretty familiar with the unbelievable amount of legislation that has been passed in the last 2 years, whether that's the bipartisan infrastructure law, which injected so much interest and capacity into the US market on EV charging stations and critical infrastructure that would help support our ability to support this evolving energy market and the new industries that come along with that. Our CHIPS Act, and as well as the IRA, which we know will inject at least $369 billion into the US economy over the next 10 years to support the evolving energy transition, as well as our EV capabilities. Along the way, the administration's invested in several tools at home, and then of course, several tools overseas. I think we'll cover lots of these today, but they were already referenced, like the DPA expanded authorities. That's not only an increased relationship with Canada, but also the capability to consider advanced battery technologies as a critical supply chain that we need to include in their capabilities. Of course, our loan program office at the Department of Energy has received a very large infusion of dollars that they are trying to use as wisely as possible across all sectors of the clean energy market. And you can see the first set of grants, or at least conditional grants that were offered, are very heavily focused on our capabilities here at home, whether that's lithium production, advanced processing capabilities, all the way to advanced batteries and EV manufacturing. And so this is a deeply thought out, multifaceted approach to how we're injecting what we need to in our own economy to ensure that we're meeting this moment in time. Overseas, I think that, I sit more in the foreign policy shop, and Adina, as you mentioned, I've covered these issues from different angles for probably the last 6 or 7 years. And I came at this first wearing a climate hat and a clean energy hat. And now this is the first time in my experience over the last several years that the idea that critical minerals, clean energy, and climate are all one thought, and that we have to think about the supply chain and the geopolitical relevance that has to our overall foreign policy. And so it's been a really interesting time to translate that into some key programs overseas. I think that all the analysis we've done in our domestic market tells us that we have to keep supporting additional investment across every element of this sector. But in the near and medium term, we're going to have gaps, right, in our sourcing capabilities, and frankly, a benefit from ensuring that we're working on resilient supply chains with partners and allies that will involve production in other countries, processing in other countries to serve ours and the global market. And so that's really what PGII is all about in a broader sense. It's really the exportation, our international side of this really advanced version of an industrial policy at home. And the idea of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is to do this work not just with the US, but with our G7 partners. And our objective is to collectively inject about $600 billion over the next 5 years into several key infrastructure sectors overseas. So ensuring that we're doing what we need in ICT and digital transformation, health, agriculture, and ensuring that we're thinking about high labor standards and gender equity along the way. But one of our biggest buckets is really the clean energy space. And that includes, of course, supporting traditional deployment of clean energy solutions around the world. So renewables, solar, wind, and other large-scale projects. But it also has a really strong focus on the upstream elements that enable these sectors to thrive. And so we're looking at projects with ourselves and with other partners that are supporting the additional production and clean processing of these essential materials around the world to serve not only our market, but our partners and allies. And it's become a really important piece of our approach overseas. That's, of course, paired with several other foreign policy and diplomatic tools. We're pursuing a handful of critical mineral agreements. We're, where needed, ensuring that we're thinking about the approach we need to in our sanctions policy for areas where not only these critical minerals for the EV transformation or the clean energy transformation, but other important commodities and sectors are being leveraged appropriately. And so you see this really, I think, interesting dynamic view on foreign policy that we're trying to think through the most meaningful ways that we can not only secure our own supply chains, but really show up around the world to support the economic development agenda of our partners in emerging economies and the global South as a whole to meet their development goals. And I hope we'll have a chance to share in the rest of this chat a couple key, really exciting projects that we've already implemented that help demonstrate that vision.
That's an excellent overview. So I have 12,000 questions for you, but I'm going to park them so we can make it part of the conversation. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you. I mean, Australia and the United States have been natural partners for generations for so many different ways. So talk about this partnership and where you see the value for both nations.
Sure. I think first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a natural evolution for Australia and the United States to be focused on climate and particularly critical minerals and the clean energy transition. We have a lot of similarities and synergies between us. If you look at a lot of the ownership of critical minerals companies in Australia, many of them are from the United States. And if you look at a lot of the mines that are operating in the United States, many of them are Australian. I think the key question here is, what do we need in order to have this green transition and have an electrification based on batteries, whether it be EV or for storage? And from the perspective of a country that focuses on mining and wants to move more into processing, what we really need to do is to create more stable prices. Markets that function well will give the right price signals to investors, which will lead to more investment where it's needed. And if you look at the prices for the battery minerals, what you'll see is a picture that doesn't actually make any sense at all. You can almost look at a tale of two prices. So you've got lithium on the one hand, where the price, although it's come off at the moment, is quite high and historically high. And that's because of the demand that the market needs. And one of the reasons that the price of lithium is working in that way is because there's quite a diverse range of suppliers of lithium. So you've got Australia, you've got Chile, you've got other deposits around the world. So you don't just have a concentration of one particular massive player, which means that there's truer price signals in the lithium market. But if you look at cobalt or nickel, those prices are almost less than the cost of production. In some cases, they are less than the cost of production. And that makes absolutely no sense given the demand that we have for those particular minerals. And the reason is because there's just a market concentration. We have one particular player. It's just straight economics. You have one particular player who's purchasing most of these commodities and one particular player who's processing most of these commodities. So they're doing it at a particular scale. But what we need, if we truly want this green transition, is we need more stable prices. And we need more stable prices to create a diversity of supply, be that in Australia, United States, other partners around the world. The Inflation Reduction Act is one response to that, and it has, at least on critical minerals, been a positive response for Australia. We estimate that we've seen over $20 billion worth of offtake since last year, which is quite a staggering amount if you consider that Australia's total exports to the United States were $20 billion. And then in a period of less than a year, we've seen offtake agreements that are larger than that. It's obviously positive for us because we're the world's largest supplier of lithium, with 53% coming out of the ground right now. We're third largest in cobalt and fifth largest in nickel. But it's got to be more than just Australia, and it may even need to be more than the Inflation Reduction Act. So, we've seen lithium prices respond in the way that you would expect, and obviously they're the major component of the battery. And so on any value-added tests, that makes a lot of sense. But, we haven't seen the same for cobalt prices. There was a Title III loan made to an Australian company operating in Idaho recently, which is testament to the fact that it's very difficult for developed countries to compete in this space where we have environmental standards, where we have labour standards. And so we have to think of what is a sustainable price that encourages mining all around the world, whether it be in Australia, in Idaho, in Indonesia. And in order to do that, we really need to look at what are the options there. That was one of the reasons why the Prime Minister and the President signed the compact that they did in Hiroshima. It's one of the first times that two countries have called out this market instability problem that we have at a leaders level. And there's a number of different actions that we're hoping to take with the United States over the coming years. One of those is just mapping supply and demand. Why do governments need to get involved in mapping? Well, they shouldn't, and it would be better if they weren't. But as we spoke about, we're talking about markets that don't function freely. We're talking about what is effectively markets that have failed. So governments do have a role in ensuring supply and demand. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is US is obviously taking on a role as a demand pull factor with the Inflation Reduction Act. And so US government will have insights into how it wants that particular act to operate. But also from an Australian perspective, many of the miners here are junior miners. And with the exception of some of those lithium projects, many of the projects in Australia have got off the ground with the support of government. And I guess up until the Inflation Reduction Act, we had this chicken and egg scenario where a junior miner was on the cusp of being able to open production, but essentially needed an offtake agreement, and no one was going to give them an offtake agreement until they could see that the production was viable and that the price was near where it needed to be. Second thing that we're hoping to do under the compact is come up with some innovative ideas to target market stability. Helaina has already been working on many of those in the Mineral Security Partnership. Standards could be really important here, I think, and we probably overlook the importance of standards. What is it that Australia and the US have in common? We both have high environmental standards. We both have high labour costs. What is a sustainable way to mine these goods, process these goods, noting that there are environmental risks with them, and then deliver them in a cost-effective way that consumers will actually purchase? And what will that mean for production in others? And the other also, I guess another factor that we're also looking at is just financing. That's been an approach of successive Australian governments to this issue. I think I've probably spoken for long enough, but effectively we need to look at what's going to change the price. And I think think of the fact that those nickel, cobalt, graphite prices haven't changed yet, notwithstanding the Inflation Reduction Act. That shows the scale of the problem that we're trying to deal with here in terms of building stable markets that have a diversification of supply and work well, which will deliver benefits to workers in Australia and the United States, but also consumers who want these green products that are better for climate and the environment.
Andrew, that's really excellent. Can I just ask you one quick follow-up? Hopefully it's not too long, but some of the costs sometimes associated with a higher standard mining sector. You mentioned labor costs, but there could also be addressing environmental concerns, maybe some of the NIMBY issues. Are there any lessons learned from Australia, where the companies there have had to address that? It may have increased the cost, but it's had a downward sort of positive impact on, improved mining, being a more greening mining. Any lessons learned, back here in the United States that we could look at Australia as a model?
Sure. I think the major miners in Australia are leaders in this space. And, it comes from their own shareholders. It comes from Wall Street capital. It comes from Australian pension funds. I mean, there's just a demand, that If you're going to be in the extractive industry, you need a certain baseline. I think the other thing to bear in mind is, particularly if we're looking at a diversification of supply and we want to see supply from many, many different sources around the world. The reality is that basically there's just, in Australia, we do have a requirement for an environmental impact assessment in our legislation. We have requirements for how, workers are treated on sites. Same in the United States. So I think it's about trying to match up those particular, those realities that we have in terms of our production with a price that is sustainable for consumers. And I think at the moment we have prices that are less than the cost of production, particularly for cobalt, graphite, some of those commodities. And that doesn't help anyone, because when you've got a monopolistic player like that, that means they can also raise the price if they want to, if they're putting others in a sort of difficult position. So
that's great. Thank you so much for that. Dave, turning to you, the IRA has come up by everybody now as a strong sort of market signal. So talk about how the industry is rising to that challenge, and how do you how are they able to do that, especially in such a tight critical mineral supply marketplace?
Sure, thanks, Adina. And I can't really thank my fellow panelists enough. I mean, you've kind of set things up for me perfectly. So for those that aren't familiar with Auto Innovators, we are a trade association, as you noted, Adina, that covers really 42 members that run the gamut. Our members not only manufacture, but we have tier 1 suppliers, battery makers, as well as tech companies, and folks that are really leading as it relates to the cleaner, safer, and smarter transportation future. So what I want to give you a sense of, and as much as we're focused on the IRA, similar to what Lachlan did, I want to kind of give some important background, which obviously informs everything that Andrew just talked about when it's pricing stability and the work that Helaina and the state and the Biden administration is committed to. The industrial policies within the IRA are absolutely important. They are without question catalysts, but also with those opportunities come some challenges. And let me just take a step back. And I think, Adina, you noted in your opening that obviously you guys track things like the semiconductor challenge. Let's just put things into perspective. If we look at the auto industry at the end of last year in the US, we produced and sold 3 million fewer vehicles than we did before the start of the COVID pandemic. So again, supply chains matter. Obviously, we've witnessed a significant impact related to semiconductor shortage, which has obviously had a pricing impact and availability. But that's really important to understand as we undertake this tremendous transformation on electrification, which the industry is committed to. But I think it's important to understand that if you compare over the last couple of years, the US from a production sales standpoint is down 3 million units. Last year, electrified vehicles, so that's battery electrics, plug-in electrics, and fuel cells accounted for roughly 7% of sales. We just put out a new quarterly report this week. I'll make sure to send it around, that underscored that at the start of this year, the first quarter, we're at 8.5% electrified sales of all light-duty vehicles. But again, that is important in terms of the trajectory. But again, in the US, it only accounts for roughly 3% of the, 3 million vehicles, or 1% of all light duty registered vehicles. So in the US, we have about 285 million vehicles on the road today. Average age is about 12 years. And you could say, well, Dave, why is this important? And I think it really gets to what Andrew was talking about. As we're talking about the increased shift to electrification, things like the IRA are going to be tremendously important to help establish that manufacturing capacity as well as bolstering supply chains. But even with some of the incentives that exist from bipartisan infrastructure on charging, or if it's the IRA related to consumer incentives or battery production tax credits, or if it's even the CHIPS Act, as was noted earlier, we need to remember, Lachlan, you said it perfectly, 10 to 15 years is the head start that China has. The US auto manufacturers, in terms of our market, are facing regulations that are dictating particular outcomes that can't be achieved without increased electrification. So we've got to keep that mindset as we have these discussions, because it's not just about transitioning to electrification. It's not happening in a vacuum. we have a global race for increased electrification, which is, Andrew noted, this is a global insatiable demand for a limited amount of products that are currently available. And if you look at some of the forecasts, not just for US demand, but global demand for battery electric vehicles, we're talking about between now and 2035, the need for over 300 mines on the critical mineral side that are necessary, which means that we needed to already had that process underway to ensure that those mines are operating, extracting, processing, and then of course they don't just ramp up overnight to meet the production capacity. So Adina, I maybe want to stop there, knowing that there's a lot of time saved here for some questions, but I think that's terribly important. As much as the IRA is a accelerant, there's also other things that the industry is waiting on for clarity in terms of how certain things will operate. We're waiting Treasury guidance. And last but not least, I'll just leave you with this. There's 97 different electrified vehicles for sale in the US today, but the average price of an electric vehicle over an internal combustion engine vehicle is over $10,000 premium. And again, they might have a lower operating cost over their useful life, but that upfront cost is going to be a barrier for consumer adoption, let alone what's necessary for charging infrastructure, the grid, and the like. So if we look at those 97 models that are available, I don't know if anybody, you certainly don't have to answer this or raise your hand, but less than 20 of those models actually are eligible for the 30D tax credit up to $7,500. Roughly half of them are only eligible for half of the credit, and the other half are eligible for the full credit. But that's going to change on a monthly basis because manufacturers have to certify under penalty of perjury that the vehicle meets a 50% threshold in terms of content on the battery side, and then on the critical mineral side, 40%, and those go up every year. But the reason I say that is less than 20 of those 97 models are eligible, but we still don't know how foreign entity of concern and other provisions will be implemented. So again, all of these supportive policies are important, but some of them come with strings attached that run against the very compliance requirements that manufacturers will face in the future as they have to electrify a greater number of the fleet. So maybe, Adina, with that, I'll pause, knowing that there's a number of questions, I'm sure.
No, thank you so much for that. I think it's a really important point because the first question I wanted to tee up for a couple of you all was thinking about, it's been said, the IRA is an industrial policy here. And I think it was Andrew that said, it would be helpful to increase that demand prospect if it wasn't just the IRA in the US, but there could be others. A couple of you have said China was already years ahead, which is their industrial policy. To what extent was China's industrial policy maybe a little too much in pulling a lot of the demand towards China? And where are those opportunities? Do you all think that there could be more demand pull through government signals, but may also address some of the challenges that Dave just brought up, not challenges, but just I guess it is challenges that the industry has to face in being able to live up to those expectations. So maybe Lachlan, I can start with you first. Are there other countries or regions where they are also sort of thinking about stimulating this demand for electrification, but also hopefully maybe thinking about how they can fulfill it in the supply chain?
Yeah, thanks, Adina. It's a great question. And I guess I want to start by saying, I think there are different industrial policy strokes for different folks, right? Different countries are going to approach this in different ways. And if you look at the way the US has approached it, it's very much through tax credits in particular. And there are very specific political reasons for that. We see those be much more politically sustainable than the types of subsidies that China, for example, relies on. In the US, there's much more reliance on stimulating private sector investment in de-risking private sector finance. That's very different to the Chinese approach with state-owned banks, large state-owned enterprises operating within these sort of vertically integrated structures. So we see, and then in Europe, again, we see the EU industrial strategy being put together and a sort of crisis of confidence a little bit even in the European single model as they sort of grapple with how do you compete with an industrial policy approach in an environment that is sort of much more conducive to kind of broad bureaucratic regulation in that European context. So, I think we're going to see these different approaches work in different ways. And sort of to one of the questions we have in the Q&A here of Catherine Ty's point that, we're going to co-own different parts of the supply chain. I think the key piece of all this is that countries need to invest in where they have a comparative advantage. That's to say, where their particular natural resources, skills, capacities, institutions are really going to lend themselves to being globally competitive. And I think the US is taking a gamble, but I think the right gamble on the EV supply chain, for example, where it has that history of automotive manufacturing in the way that, say, Australia doesn't. Australia, on the other hand, has this history of being a global leader in the mining industry. And so we're really finding ways to sort of create our own industrial strategy specific to that sector. And so I think we're going to see this sort of thousand flowers bloom here, but we're not all going to copy China's approach, and we shouldn't try and copy China's approach, because I think we're also starting to see some of the real downfalls of that in terms of their debt challenges, their productivity challenges, and so forth.
Thank you for that. Andrew, I'm going to turn back to you for a sec. Your government just released its critical mineral strategies. Is that an industrial strategy, or is it more about focused on building out supply components of the supply chain?
Well, we couldn't compete with the Inflation Reduction Act even if we wanted to. So that's always the challenge for a middle power that's not the reserve currency of the world. So I think for Australia, it's about how can we spend any money that the government decides that it wants to spend. But I think what you'll see from that critical minerals strategy is what we want is well-functioning markets. I mean, that's the best policy response that we can have. So we're only looking at government intervention where there has been a market failure. And I guess then the options that we look at are basically, we're looking at finance options. Are there options to help get mines or particular, operations off the ground? We're very keen to move into processing. Is it appropriate in those circumstances to, have some co-investment to sort of assist that? I think the second sort of, area is that demand pull, which the IRA gives. And, we said that it's been beneficial for Australia in terms of opening up new markets in addition to the ones that we already have. I think how Treasury defines some of those rules is also very important for countries like Australia, whether it be around foreign entity of concern or whether it be around, what's the definition of processing. So I think that's all very important. The other sort of, I guess, component that the strategy mentions is standards. As I mentioned before, we have standards for a variety of other products which are designed to deliver consumers confidence that a product is produced in a particular way. So that is an option, that we have if we want to see critical minerals that are produced in a particular way to particular environmental standards that consumers or people in our respective countries expect. I think, obviously, we are the closest partner with the United States on this issue, or at least we would say that. The Prime Minister has welcomed the Inflation Reduction Act. The President and the Prime Minister signed something together, and we're not blind, I guess, to the politics of trade in this country, and we don't want to suggest things that are not going to be politically palatable. But I think when we are designing these policy options, we need to be cognizant of the fact, or the US needs to be cognizant, what are its competitors doing in this space? And are they actually eliminating barriers to the trade of these products? Are they facilitating through other means, global supply chains? And so it's really interesting to look at countries like Indonesia and, the race that's on for nickel there, and which markets could that be supplied through? So what are the investment incentives there? What are the market access incentives? What are the opportunities? Do countries need to overcome some of those things through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, or are there other policy levers that people can pull?
That's excellent. I'm going to come back to the standards point. I want to come back to what you said actually earlier, which is about financing and how do we leverage financing. Helaina, the Mineral Security Partnership, somebody else had brought up. Can you talk a little bit about that initiative and, how the U.S. is partnering with certain governments? What was maybe the impetus for bringing India into the MSP? But generally, how is that initiative helping to mobilize financing and investment into critical minerals?
Sure. So the Mineral Security Partnership really is the diplomatic tool that we're using to leverage this overall strategy that I was discussing. That's part of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment and just the broader approach to critical minerals at large for the U.S. government. And the idea behind the MSP is to take as much of the demand centers around the world, countries that have like-minded goals, objectives, capabilities, to help finance some of these resources. And you can see some of these countries are also producers, which helps us bring a certain level of expertise into the conversation. And a big element of what the MSP is designed to do is to shine a light on issues, projects, opportunities with a collective eye of the now 13 partners that are a part of the partnership directly. India has been a really interesting addition, and I know that was a very important priority for our team that's been running those efforts. And I think the idea is that India is not only an important strategic partner for the U.S. and many other members of the MSP, including our Australian partners, who I think have been very strong advocates for India joining the MSP for the last several months. Not only are they a big demand center, but there's interesting roles that they can play in some of the downstream elements of this supply chain. There's roles they can play as a thought leader. And what I hope to see the MSP continue to do is think about expanding that tent over time in the right way to bring in some of the producing countries in a more formal fashion. And this is really essential to hit one of the key elements that I think has now come up a handful of times, which is there's only so many ways available to us to create certainty in a market, especially when you have non-market actors who have put us in a situation where we're trying to add some resiliency and redundancy and more players, right? And so it takes a little bit of time to address those issues and lots of different types of tools. Of course, offtake certainty really helps. I think as we start codifying some of our rules here, whether that's foreign entity of concern or some of the Treasury guidances, that will give the market a little bit more certainty. And we're really looking forward to getting to that place. But another piece is really thinking through coherency around standards. And that is complicated. The MSP has taken that on in a really thoughtful way and has remained committed to an effort to bring together across all elements of at least the upstream elements of a critical mineral supply chain, existing standards, existing thresholds that put together or separately really hit at least the floor of what is really required to participate in our markets. I think that's a really important message, not only to send to producing countries, but also for ourselves as we continue to modify and iterate as this industry is changing, or these industries are changing so much in real time. I think the big balance, and I'm sure you can talk to any of the certification entities that are out there now, is really trying not to create a whole new set of standards that can further complicate the market, but really leverage what's best and make sure that is clear. We're hoping that will also be an important deliverable from the MSP and our further work.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did want to come back to standards. As I said, Helaina, just sticking with you for 1 second, how does then the MSP also maybe tie into the IEA's new charge by the G7 to maybe come up with a set of standards in mining?
I think they're going to work hand in hand. And so the IEA's mandate is quite large and supportive of the MSP, PGII, and frankly, many of the IEA members' individual critical mineral strategies. And the idea, right, is to create a place where the IEA can do what it does best, help us analyze markets, think about forecasts under different scenarios and opportunities, and give us a space to think through new creative mechanisms like a potential voluntary stockpile and others. So we see this all as complementary, but we understand those that are looking outside in may see a lot of different initiatives. And so part of my job is to help demystify that.
And then I'm going to stick with you for one more follow-up question, because it's sort of related because of all of this work that is happening in these international settings, in bilateral engagements, such as with Australia. Do you see some of the deals that are in these negotiations that you're taking place could help potentially create a glide path for permitting discussions back here, like how the U.S. can think about standards issues as we address, concerns as part of the broader permitting reform dialogue here? Because as I think everybody has already mentioned, we need the on-ramps for getting projects going take so long, and sometimes they're held up in permitting.
Yeah, I find that such an interesting question. And for me, I'll create a parallel to what I've learned from my days doing a lot of our work on the climate diplomacy side. Ultimately, what we do internationally, whether that's in our formal negotiations, new arrangements, new incentive packages, having a connection back to our efforts at home and our capabilities to legislate reform only enhances our credibility on both sides of that coin, right? And so as we're starting to tackle permanent reform in a really meaningful way, and that's permanent reform across all elements of the energy sector, whether that's the mining code, oil and gas leases, and then really important permitting reform we need for the capabilities to actually continue our electrification and renewable projects. That only opens our market up more to participate in the global market that we're actively negotiating and trying to create in multiple different ways. And I think if we captured anything from this conversation today, is that we're operating in a really dynamic set of markets with mismatched timelines and a kind of new view on how we have to tackle them collectively and as individual entities. And so I see this as a mutually reinforcing set of conversations.
Thank you for that, Lachlan. Because you look at critical minerals from this wide lens. Have you seen, maybe examples out in the world that can sort of, feed back into this pipeline of what's happening elsewhere, in good examples, lessons learned in permitting that could be useful to the discussions back here?
I would defer to Andrew on this one, I think, because the best example I can think of is Australia, and I think we have found ways of, as you said, sort of being leaders in this space when it comes to addressing the sort of environmental versus kind of speed trade-off here. So maybe Andrew, if you want to jump in.
Please do.
Sure. I think there's, we see as a government that Australia has a comparative advantage with permitting and environmental protection. I'm not sure all of the mining companies always see it in that particular way. And, there's been some statements, including quite recently. I think the point for permitting is that it's got to be iterative. It's something, clearly the Australian community demands a high level of environmental protection for its mines, whilst at the same time wanting to enjoy the benefits of the revenue from that. So it's about striking that balance. And I think it's got to be more than just domestic governments here. It comes back to, if we want these minerals, if we want electric vehicles, if we want solar panels on our roofs, there's a level of extraction that the world is not currently doing. And we need to have a realistic conversation about what is the right price to support production of those goods in the United States, in Australia, in Indonesia, that is sustainable and doesn't create its own raft of environmental issues.
You're on mute, Adina.
Muted.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry for that. I was going to ask one more question to Dave before I turn it back to Ken. We haven't really, I think it's a whole other session in thinking about circularity and recycling of critical minerals. There's a lot of attention to lithium, but not necessarily more broadly than that. But I was wondering if you can take 1 second just to talk about how, the industry may also be looking at recycling or maybe even material substitution as an opportunity to also relieve pressure on securing critical minerals.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think it fits hand in hand. I mean, obviously, whether it's extraction, production, or end of life, the industry itself on the auto side is committed to, end of life policies and practices. We've got a great framework in terms of lead acid batteries presently. I mean, it's a huge success story. But again, I think if you just look at what some of the recycling recovery businesses in the U.S. are anticipating once that gets their footing underway, we're talking about the possibility of saving about maybe 20% of what otherwise might be needed from a production standpoint. So I wanted to put that out there. And as we wrap, I can't help, and Ken, I know as you take back the microphone, the one key takeaway I would love everybody to have from this session, not just from the auto perspective, but as much as important as critical minerals are, they are just one aspect of the host of things that need to come into place for all of this to be successful. So again, this isn't about saying that something is or isn't achievable, but again, it's not about whether manufacturers or autos can make an electrified vehicle. It's whether or not the supported policies, whether it's on the critical mineral supply chain, whether it's on the regulations that require a certain outcome that may or may not be feasible if you don't have widespread public acceptance, which gets into the affordability, gets into the charging infrastructure, all of those things. So if there was one thing that people walked away from is as important as industrial policy is, we need sustained and robust commitments, not only at the federal level, but for years to come to make sure that, the shared objective of increased electrification, can be realized.
I think it's a great final point, because I do want to acknowledge we had a question about, how do you establish critical industry sectors such as magnets, which are essential for a whole wide range of green tech and their need for rare earths. And so we didn't have enough time to touch on all of the different sectors here today that rely on these things. And I think it just means that it's scope for another event in the future. Ken, what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've looked at various aspects of the IRA bill. We've also looked at the investments that are being done in the semiconductor sector of the economy, and that's what that question from Mario Palacios at Applied Materials relates to, is the importance of critical minerals for some of these other sectors as well, and achieving our industrial policy goals. So thank you all for your time. Thanks to everybody who stuck around for this session. Really meaty discussion on just an incredibly important topic, which we knew when we first announced this just 2 weeks ago, when we had about 130 people respond within the first 24 hours to sign up. So we knew there was a lot of interest in this. Really grateful to the 5 of you for joining us, and Adina for all your help in putting this terrific panel together. Thank you, Helaina, Andrew, Lachlan, Dave, and of course, Adina, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon, either in person at the WIDA annual dinner or